Okay, well, now that we're all set up here, good morning. I'm Dean DeVoe. I'm University Archivist and University Librarian at the University of West Florida, Pensacola. I'm in charge of the University Archive and the West Florida History Center, which is a very large, vast collection of 1.5 million manuscripts, records, maps, documents, all kinds of things. Today I'm going to be discussing the people part of developing an emergency plan or emergency planning. Next slide, please. Although the training program focuses on developing emergency plans, you have to realize that you're actually doing two tasks. You're preparing for an emergency, and then you're also doing the action of handling an emergency. These are interrelated, but I think it's important to be aware that they have two distinct actions with somewhat different demands. Both activities, the development of the plan and the action in the event of the emergency, depend on people. Both action, development, and response require from the beginning that you develop a chain of command. And normally when we talk about developing an emergency plan, we talk about having a committee of internal and external members as well as administrators and decision makers to help you form that thing. And then we also talk about having an action team in handling an emergency. And let's go to the next slide, please. In developing the emergency plan, the Getty plan, Getty Institute plan that they recommend that you have a director, an emergency preparedness committee, the emergency preparedness manager, and an emergency response coordinator. And they all have nice little acronym names. Problems I have with this, quite frankly, and you notice, and the coordinator is usually chosen after the plan is developed. In other words, you have somebody on board that is the responder, the point person when you have an emergency. Next slide, please. The guide also outlines roles and responsibilities for all four of these bodies. And I'm not going to repeat all that here, but simply the role of the director is to begin the process of creating an emergency plan by committing the organization to its development and fostering cooperation of the staff in the importance of the plan. The Emergency Preparation Committee develops a plan led by the manager or team leader, and the Emergency Response Coordinator is actually chosen after the plan is developed, and this is the person responsible for being the leader in times of a real emergency. In short, in developing the emergency preparedness plan, there's a chain of command and development. Of course, these are all people. Development of the plan should be a cross-section of all areas of the library, the archive, and the museum. This ensures that the knowledge is shared. This also ensures that there's a buy-in of staff in understanding what is going on and what is happening. This is very important because emergency preparedness needs to be made aware, the staff need to be made aware that it is really part of their job as well. It also ensures that more than one person is familiar with the plan. Next slide, please. The reason I like to see everyone involved in an organization is that I've found it really in personal experience, most libraries, the archive, and museums have small staff. You may be the committee and the director and the coordinator. And also when you have a small staff, you may have the likelihood that when you do have an emergency, the one person you want to handle it is not there that day. They're on vacation or they're away or whatever. And so you really need in the people planning to make sure that everyone is involved in the process. I think that's a very important component of people planning and emergency planning. Now to make it really simple in developing the people part of your plan, there really are only three groups of people. And I call these the check writers, the problem solvers, and the problem handlers. Next slide, please. The check writers are what I call those people that have the monetary resources to respond to an emergency. It could be the director, the board of trustees, the organization treasurer, or whatever. This is usually where the authority of an organization may also rest in terms of commitment to developing the emergency plan, authorizing staff training, and so forth. It is crucial in emergency planning to identify this component. Next slide, please. I should clarify that one. Another component in the check writing category is the issue of insurance. You need to know who handles that in your organization, who your agent is, how to contact him or her. You may have different kinds of insurance, and so therefore you may have building insurance, especially if you rent a facility, you don't own the building. You may have collection insurance. You may have other kinds of workman comp and other kinds of things, and you really need to have that information handy. The reason is that part of the plan, you need to know what the policy requires. For example, reimbursement may be tied to documenting condition, what was done, and you may need to have somebody, designate somebody on your staff in an emergency, the document coordinator, somebody who is, say, filming or taking pictures of the damage, taking pictures of the objects or whatever, so you have a record of that kind of thing. Now, the second category I mentioned, the problem solvers, are those individuals who have an authority to identify the crisis, direct its solution, act as a communication venue, and training to the check writers and the problem handlers. The Getty Manual disperses these responsibilities to different people, but in many settings, you simply do not have the staff to do that. When I got a call one year at 1 o'clock in the morning, and they said, come to the library, water is flowing into the basement. Well, the basement is where my office and collections are. And I get out there, and they had been doing some construction. They had some rain. They had drilled some holes in the concrete floor from the first floor to the basement, and water was pouring in, and there was 3 inches of water across the floor in one of my rooms. And stupid me, I learned a valuable lesson from that. Stupid me had boxes stacked in that room 4 high, and of course the bottom was sitting in the 3 inches of water, so we had to move every stack we had to move 3 boxes to get to that box. But I was the only person. There were only 2 staff members in my department, and I was the only person, so I had to act as telling people what we were doing. I had to direct people when they got there. I had to get the janitors working, all of that kind of stuff. So you may have, when you have a small staff, your problem solver may be the one that has to handle everything. And also that problem solver is the one that says, here's what we need to do, here's who we need to contact. You can have a lot of people help you, but sometimes they just don't know what to do at the moment. So the next slide, please. The problem handlers are the third category, and these are the people who will work on the problem hand, whether it be salvage or cleanup or whatever. They can include staff, volunteers, anyone that's helping you resolve a problem. And you may have 2 problem solvers. You may have one directing the staff and someone else coordinating communication. In a university setting like mine, somebody's got to communicate with facilities, they've got to communicate with security, they've got to communicate with the library administration, things like that. All the while, you're picking up all these wet boxes and trying to move them and trying to salvage things. But whatever the arrangement, you have to fill these out in your emergency plan. Next slide, please. Emergency response requires a cross-section of people, so you need to identify in your planning process your organization's leaders, the staff, the board, etc., your local area emergency responders, and that is both internal if you're in an organization and external. For example, if your organization may depend on the local fire, police, civil defense, etc., and of course your own organization staff. You also might ask some of the external people to serve temporarily on your emergency preparedness committee in drawing up the plan. If you don't want to include them, ask if they'll at least review the draft plan. Consider other areas of emergency services also. For example, my county, Escambia County, have an emergency command center for centralizing response that we activate whenever we think we're being affected by a hurricane or a tropical storm or tornadoes or something like that. But in considering people to be part of your plan, you need to understand the need to identify the person who is the coordinator. Next slide, please. The responsible coordinator is going to be the person in charge of an emergency and should also have a backup person in case that person is not there. You need to have a master contact list of all of your staff, their home, their emergency phone numbers, their cell phone numbers, their mobile numbers, maybe their personal email if they will share that with you, all that kind of stuff, because you need to know where people are in emergency. Every member of your staff should have this not only at the office, but also at home. They should have some way of accessing that when they're not at the place of business. I have gone through hurricanes in Pensacola without power. The phone lines don't work for the internet. After one of our major hurricanes where the power was out, one of our librarians told me that she went around to some stores that were open asking if they had any Princess telephones still in stock, because our AT&T system had power through the landline, so if you could plug a phone in, you would have a phone. But the mobiles didn't work because there was no power to the cell towers, or they were too far away, and we had problems like that. We also, in evacuating Pensacola, a lot of people left the area, and therefore we had no way of knowing whether the person that could handle an emergency at our library, for example, was still even in the area where we could find them. The director of our library, for example, I'm not saying this meanly, but he left and went to Louisiana, went to New Orleans, 200 miles away, to check on his mother and be with his family. So we didn't have anyone on the spot to be the coordinator, keep an eye on the place, see if any of our windows were broken by falling trees, and what kind of water and that kind of thing. Well, therefore, and you may not have power for the computer, but you can't check the email to say, oh, where is somebody? Well, you need to have the kind of contact. We actually had a system in our place where we didn't have power to get to people, but we could actually get out and drive to their home. And so we had addresses and we could check on people that way. Your directory has to be updated. It should be updated at least once a month because people change. Their names, their phone numbers, their addresses change, their email changes, other kinds of things. And also I agree that these things to be printed because you need a paper copy. If the computer doesn't work, you go to use your portable notebook, and by golly, the battery's dead on it because you didn't plug it in. We actually, the second day of one of our hurricanes, where the power had been out for 2 days, people's phones and all started going dead on them because they had no power. They had no way to power them up. Next slide, please. In problem solvers, the people that are going to be doing the cleanup, they have to be overseen by a coordinator or somebody designated as a supervisor. I can't stress the importance of this kind of direction enough. After a disaster, there is a tendency to panic. There's a tendency to say, oh my God, we've got to do something. The area that I had where Bob was sitting on the floor, why, I had a number of people show up willing to help, and they just start grabbing stuff, and they need some direction. They panic. There are people, good-natured people, who believe that once records are wet, they need to be tossed because they're wet paper, but they're actually salvageable. And so therefore you need somebody. You may be inundated with volunteers. We, being a university, we had students show up willing to help, but they didn't know what to do. You need to identify with your volunteers a couple of key things before they help you. And they need to know that are they going to be uncomfortable in working with things? Are there physical lifting issues? Are there allergies? Are there phobias? You need to know some of these things from your volunteers. When I hire student workers for my archive, these are standard questions I ask people. Are you allergic to anything? Because we may get boxes and records that come in from a home that's full of cats or full of dogs or llamas or whatever, and we need to know if there's an allergy. We need to know if there's a limit on your physical lifting. We don't want to hire somebody and then have somebody say, oh, they have back problems now and so forth. It gets us in a lot of hot water. So we have those kind of things. And you must do that, coordinator must also do that with the volunteer staff that are. There have been many disasters where more damage was caused by the good-hearted volunteers than the original crisis. And so therefore it's something to keep in. Sometimes people handling wet books don't know how to handle wet books properly. They cause more damage in moving the wet book than they otherwise would need to, or newspaper. Next slide, please. In coping with the disaster, another thing you need to know about people is that people can be shaken, horrified. They can be like deer caught in the headlights. They can be angry. Why is this happening to us? There can be a feeling of urgency when there really is a need to proceed slowly and steadily, for example. You can expect people to have an adrenaline high. You can expect a tendency to overreact. This is why you need very carefully a training of the staff. You also need to have coordination. You need to understand that a lot of people don't recognize one of the problems we have in museums and archives tends to be water. There tend to be leaks. It tends to be leaks from the sprinkler system. It tends to be accidental thing, and people don't realize how heavy wet books can be, for example. They absorb a great deal of water and other materials, and so they're very heavy. So you have to check these kind of things. I would also recommend that for volunteers, that you also consider having volunteers get tetanus shots. One of the things we will deal with a lot in archive are rusty items, pins, staples, rusty metal objects in museums, and that kind of thing. I'm not saying that you really need that for the disaster, but it's something that should be part of your planning and your operation in the museum. Next slide, please. You also can expect some chaos and disorganization in coping with a disaster. You need to expect to find you can't think clearly. You expect to think you've probably ruined the whole response effort or ruined valuable material. These are all normal feelings in coping with a disaster, and it's important that staff understand them and that they can learn to work with them. You can expect to be tired, dirty, hungry, and discouraged. One of the last hurricanes we had in Pensacola, I had 6 40-foot pine trees fall around my house. None of them hit the house, amazingly, but I spent the next 3 weeks with no power, and it was hot. It was summertime, and my wife got frightened because she imagined me like Jason walking around all the time with this chainsaw because I was working on these trees. But it was tired, it was dirty, it was hungry. You can easily get discouraged in responding to any kind of a disaster. Next slide, please. I want to summarize all this again by saying the people factor. It is very important. You're going to hear that again today. It's very important that you work with the local emergency people that you have with you. It's very important that you participate in planning an emergency. I will tell you what happened. One thing that happened this week on my campus is the fact that I noticed our fire extinguishers they had for my department. The fire extinguisher has the letters A, B, C on them. There were 3 types of extinguishers for a fire. If you look up the National Fire NFPA pamphlet 232 for archives and museums, it does not recommend A, B, C fire extinguishers because to combat B and C fires, it contains a chemical in it that will harm paper and objects, and therefore it recommends A fire extinguisher. So I asked our people, why did I have an ABC extinguisher, and they informed me that every fire extinguisher on campus was ABC. And that's something I'm going to have to resolve when I get back because we have a record center, we have a herbarium that preserves plants, we have a science building, which of course ABC would work better for them. And so you have to consider those kinds of things. I especially noted in my comments that the Getty guide, the field guide to emergency response is a vital tool. I would recommend this item for any of you. Next slide, please. And thank you very much. That's just kind of a quick overview, and I hope I've given you some ideas for thinking and discussion in your facilities and other facilities. I would also remind you that in working with people, many of your facilities change staff, some of them a lot more frequently than others, and you really need at least once a year or part of the core training of a new staff member to have an emergency meeting and go over any plans and things that you have, who have responsibility, where you keep supplies and storage things. We have a closet in my shop called a hurricane closet in the archive, and in it are sheets of plastic and other kinds of things. I actually have candles and matches in there, although I haven't made that let a lot of people know about that. But it gets pretty dark in our basement when you don't have any power at all, and also when they depend on an outside generator that runs out of fuel, and they can't get fuel to campus, or the emergency lights which on battery. And I've actually been at the university long enough that we actually had a week that I saw those batteries go completely kaput. So you have to kind of put your mental mind in thinking of those kind of things. And now we're open for questions. Are there any questions?